So we've done cellular respiration, which was the whole process of glycolysis to the citric acid cycle and then the electron transport chain. But all of that required oxygen to occur. Glycolysis does not. So glycolysis happens without oxygen. But without oxygen, you cannot enter the citric acid cycle or the electron transport chain. We can only do glycolysis. So when oxygen is not present, the products of glycolysis, which are pyruvate, will instead go through a process called fermentation. Remember in the process of glycolysis that we are taking glucose and turning it into pyruvate. During this process, we are going to make a net of 2 ATPs, which is great. We get some energy. During this process, we also take 2 NAD+ and turn them into 2 NADH. Normally, during aerobic respiration, these NADHs would go over to the electron transport chain, remove the electrons, and then the electron transport chain would give back the NAD+, and glycolysis can continue to work. However, when oxygen is not present, the NADH does not go to the electron transport chain, and NAD+ is not regenerated. So if we never actually make any more NAD+, this becomes a limiting reactant, and glycolysis is only going to continue as long as the cell has some NAD+. Eventually, this will run out, and we will have to stop doing glycolysis. That's really bad because once we stop doing glycolysis, we can't make any more ATP, and at this point, the cell can't generate any ATP. So the whole point of fermentation is to couple with glycolysis and regenerate NAD+. So the NADH is going to come down here to fermentation, and it's going to send back NAD+, so that the process of glycolysis can continue to occur. There are 2 types of fermentation. The first is alcohol fermentation. This is used by yeast, some bacteria. This is actually the process that we use to make alcohol, so like beer and wine, as well as baking, because the bread rises from the carbon dioxide released from the yeast. So the first step is glycolysis. Glycolysis, you guys already know, is going to make me 2 ATPs, 2 NADH, and 2 pyruvates. The pyruvate is then going to lose some carbon dioxide. This is why beer and wine have a bubbliness, because they've released carbon dioxide. The pyruvate is eventually turned into ethanol, which is an alcohol. And in that process, we are going to use the energy in NADH to transform it into ethanol, and that's going to regenerate NAD+ to continue to be used in glycolysis. So as long as this process has glucose, it can continue to make ATP and ethanol and continue to do glycolysis. So the whole point of the fermentation section is to regenerate NAD+ so that glycolysis can keep making ATP. A very similar reaction happens in humans. So this is called lactic acid fermentation. And what it does is it produces lactic acid or lactate instead of alcohol. Again, the same first step, we have glucose. We're going to make our 2 ATPs, our 2 NADH, and our 2 pyruvates. The pyruvate doesn't lose any oxygens or carbons. This is why we don't have carbonation or bubbliness in our fermentation. So this is going to happen when there's no oxygen around. Often this is happening during strenuous exercise. This might cause you to get kind of a cramp in your side. So what happens when there's no oxygen available to your muscle tissue is that they will go through this lactic acid fermentation. They produce lactate, and at the same time, we regenerate NAD+. so that glycolysis can keep making our measly 2 ATPs. Eventually, after you stop exercising and you start breathing again, the liver will turn lactate back into pyruvate later on and allow pyruvate to go over to the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. But both of these processes, cellular respiration and fermentation, all start with this process of glycolysis. So the very first step, no matter where you go, is to do glycolysis, make your 2 ATPs, your pyruvate, and your NADH. NAD has to be oxidized, or NAD is reduced into NADH. And this is a temporary energy storage. This has to be turned back into NAD plus for glycolysis to continue. This can either be done in the electron transport chain if you have oxygen, or it can be done with fermentation if you don't have any oxygen. There's a lot of differences between cellular respiration and fermentation, though. So they're going to have different ways of oxidizing NADH back to NAD+. In fermentation, we're going to have an organic molecule, such as pyruvate, turning into either lactic acid or alcohol. In cellular respiration, this happens at the electron transport chain. And there's a vast difference in the number of ATP produced. So fermentation only produces the 2 ATPs in glycolysis, whereas cellular respiration is going to create 32 ATPs because it can make a lot of NADH and then send those all to the electron transport chain to make a ton of ATP. An obligate anaerobe. Think about the word obligated. Obligated means you have to do it. So an obligate anaerobe is somebody who cannot survive in the presence of oxygen. So this is an organism that has to live with no oxygen. So these are always going to do either fermentation or anaerobic respiration. Sometimes they can do the whole respiration cycle and just use like sulfur instead of oxygen. There are many organisms like yeast and bacteria that are called facultative anaerobes, meaning that they can do either. They can either do cellular respiration if oxygen is present, or if you stick the yeast in a barrel and don't allow them to get any more oxygen, they will ferment and go through fermentation and make you alcohol. Humans are obligate aerobes. So we have to have oxygen. We can only do lactic acid fermentation for a very short period of time. Lactic acid builds up in our muscles. It causes problems. It's actually a metabolic poison. So if we stop breathing oxygen and we stop doing cellular respiration, we die. So because glycolysis is that very first step in all of these reactions, we believe that this is the most ancient process. So we likely think that glycolysis formed first, that early prokaryotes were able to do glycolysis before oxygen even accumulated in the atmosphere. So early planet Earth had a lot of carbon dioxide and not very much oxygen until later on when plants started to develop on the planet. So it's likely that glycolysis is a process that formed on early Earth before even plants were around, because it would have been able to function and make some energy without oxygen. It's then probable that other additional organelles, as they developed, were able to kind of add to this pathway to create this whole process of cellular respiration, which includes the citric acid cycle and then the electron transport cycle, which are much more complicated metabolic pathways. So this whole time we've been looking at just glucose. But the truth is that other molecules can be used for food. We know that all carbohydrates can be used for energy, so starch, glycogen, disaccharides like maltose, sucrose, and other monosaccharides like fructose can be used for energy. And those actually are going to just enter glycolysis. So something like starch probably just needs to be broken down into glucose. Same thing for glycogen, it just needs to be broken down into glucose, and then it can go right into glycolysis. Proteins are usually not used for fuel except in a very, very extreme starvation situation. So most of the time you're not using proteins for energy unless you're starving yourself. However, they can be. It's not very fuel efficient, but they can be. So the amino acids can actually lose their amino groups. So we're going to get rid of the NH2 because we don't want the nitrogen. And then this is going to enter into the citric acid cycle. Fats, remember, fats have the most calories per gram. So fats actually have a ton of energy stored. The glycerol is broken down into a product called G3P, which is actually one of the intermediate steps of glycolysis. And then those fatty acids can be broken down into acetyl-CoA, which can then go into the citric acid cycle. We know that fat produces more than twice the amount of ATP as carbohydrates or proteins. So fat is going to produce about 9 calories per gram, and then carbs and proteins only produce about 4 calories per gram. So fat is a highly energetic energy storage molecule. So here you can see kind of where those enter. Carbohydrates are going to either enter as glucose, meaning like we take starch and enter it as glucose. Some other ones like fructose. The second step of glycolysis is actually to turn glucose into fructose, so they can enter usually in this first step of glycolysis. Fats, which are our next main source of energy, the glycerols can be turned into something called G3P, which is a step in glycolysis. And those large fatty acid carbo chains are typically broken into 2 carbon chains that can be turned into acetyl-CoA and then go through the whole citric acid cycle. Amino acids need to lose their amino group, so they need to get rid of that nitrogen. They can be turned into a variety of different things, so pyruvate, acetyl-CoA, or more often, one of the citric acids put in the citric acid cycle. All of these processes are entering in either glycolysis or the citric acid cycle, which means they're going to help produce NADH and FADH2, which are going to be able to come over here to oxidative phosphorylation and make a whole lot of ATP.